Naturally low in calories too.
I don't want to hear about it.
You're not going to stop talking about it.
I don't want to hear any more about
Well,
it.
I want to talk about it.
Just
Get
shut
me-
up, will you?
No!
Just shut up! Shut up!
I was really badly bruised from, as I said, the waist, well, about the hip level to the knee. I was just black, absolutely black.
It's called the battered wife syndrome, not a new phenomena, but a frightening one. In fact, family violence of this type occurs in as many as 1 in 3 live-in relationships. Horrifying experiences like the ones these women have been put through.
He didn't harm me above the waist. The injuries occurred between my waist and my knees, but it was really very bad. I had a lot of bruises. He tore all my clothes off. Everything I had on, every single item of clothing I had on was ripped, ruined. I put them all in the garbage can. The only thing that was still intact were my shoes.
Well, the first time was just a matter of, slapping and stuff like that, but the second one wasn't too good. It was a bit more violent, kicking and punching and stuff like that.
An actual fist fight?
Yeah.
Were you beaten to the point that you couldn't go out of the house for...
In my first marriage, yeah.
Black eyes, cut lips?
Mm-hmm.
An actual fist fight, then?
Right. Dodging constantly.
But the beaten women are coming forward. Small numbers of them getting out of the hell they've lived in many cases for years. And part of the reason is the high profile taken by some agencies like the United Way in this commercial, part of a national campaign.
And health, they lived happily ever after. Until the beatings began. So many beatings you can't even count the times. There are a lot more like her, living in fear, afraid to leave, afraid to stay. They need help in turning their lives around, help with their kids while they do. Thanks to you, there is help. The United Way.
18-year-old Laura is one of the beaten women. She became pregnant. She and her common-law husband had little money. She never dreamed he'd beat her.
Yeah, the difference was so unreal, It's like a big charade, I'll do this for you. He used to do everything for me. He was almost too perfect. And then as soon as we moved in together, he kind of had me cornered. I had no money. I couldn't go back to my mom with the baby. So my mom couldn't help. Nobody could help me because I was stuck where I was, financially, which was the biggest problem. He used to blame me, I have to pay all the bills because you got pregnant, You could have done something about it.
Tell me how one of these fights would develop when you were battered.
Oh, he would just start drinking, then I'd ask him maybe to make up a bottle for the baby, and he'd say, no, that's a mother's job. And I said, well, you're the father too, and you're always complaining about, you can never do enough for her, so just do this for me and her. And then he'd start on, I pay the bills, that should be enough. And I run this house and I make it a home. Because without me, you'd be nowhere, you'd have nothing.
Would he chase you around the house and kick and hit you?
If I wouldn't let him, he got mad at me one day and then he wanted to hold the baby because she was crying, because we were both fighting. She was upset and he went to her and I went to pick her up because I didn't know what he was going to do, and then he'd just start hitting me while I grabbed the baby, so that I wouldn't take her.
So he actually hit you when you had the baby?
Yeah.
Ellie represents the great masses of middle-income women. Married twice, both her men beat her. It went on for years.
The arguments would start if there hadn't been any drinking, and they would just end. They wouldn't be solved or anything until there was a drink, and it would come up again, and it would be worse.
So the liquor brought out sort of the chip on the shoulder,
right,
and the violent action.
Right.
Were they severe fights?
In my first marriage, yeah.
What effect do you think that had on your children? How old's your oldest?
6.
What
on
effect?
Christmas Eve. Quite a bit. She talks about how she heard me screaming the night we left, and my younger one, well, he talks about the first fight and how he saw it all.
So they're at a perceptive age that, as you were when you were young.
Right, right.
That they're going to probably remember it.
Right, they're kind of confused about the whole thing.
What made you sort of come to the realization that you had to escape?
Because thinking so many times that I could do something about it, and realizing that as my life was going on, I wasn't solving anything at all. I figured we weren't getting help, so I better get help.
And you weren't going to change these people?
That's right. It couldn't be changed by me because I've tried, and I don't maybe know how to cope with that. So I have to find out how to stop it before my children get into it.
Do you accept some of the responsibility yourself?
I must, because it's got to be both sides, I guess, maybe from my childhood.
Pat was married for 7 years to a man who is now a prominent doctor. It took her a long time to get over her fear of men, but she still remembers the hell her former husband put her through.
We were on the honeymoon when the first evidence of violent behavior came up. It wasn't that violent at that time, just in the form of slaps. A slap when he was angry with me.
Did the batterings happen with some sort of regularity over the years?
During the period, well, it escalated. During the period of the marriage, overall, I would say it averaged about once every 3.5, 4 months.
Alcohol involved on these occasions?
Oh yes, very much so.
This is the catalyst in the whole fistfight affair.
It certainly was in the majority of instances affecting me, yes, very much.
Do you remember a specifically violent occasion?
Yes, I remember one very violent occasion. It was at Christmas time. I don't think he knew what he was doing. He was really violent. It was the worst incident in the whole marriage was this particular incident. He didn't harm me above the waist. The injuries occurred between my waist and my knees, but it was really very bad. I had a lot of bruises. He tore all my clothes off. Everything I had on, every single item of clothing I had on was ripped, ruined. I put them all in the garbage can. The only thing that was still intact were my shoes.
Similarities exist in most wife-beating situations. The booze, the arguments over money, the past family experiences which make many women surprisingly think that a wife-beater is a normal husband.
Yeah, my dad used to do it quite a lot to my mum because he was drinking and stuff like that.
A lot of arguments?
Yeah. And
violent fights?
Yeah, yeah, especially towards the end.
Over a number of years?
Yeah, I think right from the start, you know. It was just the same situation, just got together because of the kids.
Do you relate that experience, your growing up, to what's happened to you as being sort of a normal thing in a relationship?
Yeah, well, I've seen it a couple times, and I just thought, you know, that's what everybody does. You know, like, everybody hits their wives, and that's just part of the marriage.
It happened at home, and...
Yeah.
And did it happen to any of your relatives as well, or?
Yeah, I went to stay with my aunt one time, and my uncle beat on her too, so I just, you know, I didn't think my mom and dad were any special then. First I thought they did. It was special, you know. He shouldn't do that, but then I saw my uncle and aunt, and then I figured that was normal.
So it was an all too common thing in your background, and you related it as being normal in your relationship, at least at first.
Yeah. I mean, you know, like for my mom, it was too late. But for anybody who wants to do something, just sit down and look at the things, weigh the pros and cons, and then if it says get out as fast as you can, and don't, you know, kind of hold on to what you had.
When you say it was too late for your mom, what do you mean?
Well, she had gotten into a pattern so much that she couldn't care. She gave up on herself, you know. She thought, oh, that's it, that's my life, you know, that's what I've been brought in this world to do, is to be beaten up sort of thing and put down and everything.
Oh, nothing like that in my family at all. That's one of the things I couldn't believe it was happening to me. I had nothing like that in my family.
How about your husband?
My husband's family, he told me, he didn't talk about it much, but he told me that his father was an alcoholic on one occasion. I did meet his parents, but they lived in another country, so I can't verify that from my own knowledge.
Do you suspect that...
I suspect he probably did beat his wife.
And do you think that this perhaps had an effect on your husband?
I think my husband learned that he didn't have to worry about women. They were, you know, you could do what you wanted to women, that they were there to be subservient to the man. I think that's a pattern he learned in his family.
Let's go back to your childhood. Any beatings, father beating your mother
Yes,
frequently,
quite often, and very heavy arguments.
violently?
I can remember a few times, yes.
And what did you do as children?
Well, we hid under the couch, or we'd hide in our rooms, or anything to get away from it.
Did you ever think for a minute, as you were growing up, that you'd be caught in that same element?
No, I always had it planned I would never live like that.
Did you know when it was happening to you that
No.
it was really happening?
No, I always thought it could be cured. Whatever was starting would stop.
That you could change your husband?
Right,
Or I should say husbands.
right.
Before you got married to both men, did you see anything in them that would bring on this kind of violent reaction?
No, they completely acted altogether differently before we were married.
And what was the change?
It went from affectionate and thoughtful to not caring and rough.
And there are similarities in almost all wife-beating situations if the police are called in. It's usually the standard reply from the husband and wife who just moments ago were fighting with their fists.
They want to see the police, but they can also relate that tomorrow is another day. If they lay a charge against their husband, or the husband lays a charge against the wife, the next day it's the family that ends up paying, and they pay almost as much as the accused person.
So there's a reluctance, I guess, on their part to take it all the way.
Oh yes, definitely, I would say a reluctance.
And perhaps a reluctance on their part to admit that they're the ones in the wrong and blame it on somebody else.
There are some cases like this. The majority of them, though, one blames the other. First thing we tell our members to do is to separate the two, the husband and the wife, and to try and calm the situation down as much as they can, and to advise both parties what their rights are in this type of situation. Now, in relation to this, we have members of the Human Resources working in our police stations, both downtown at 312 Main Street and at Oak Ridge at 41st and Cambie.
One of the things police tell the women they encounter after being called to a family dispute is that they have an outlet, somebody they can call for help and advice, the crisis line, where they can discuss their humiliating problem with anonymity.
And we wouldn't give them advice, we would give them some alternatives that they could do. We would want to identify the situation immediately as to the emergency of the situation, whether the husband is right there, do they have some time to go, and then give them some alternatives and that they could seek out.
What kind of alternatives?
Counseling for themselves, counseling for the two, the husband and the wife, protection from the husband through the court system if there needs to be, legal proceedings, a separation or legal separation, divorce, leaving and getting protection at a transition house to protect them for the next few weeks or so.
Where do women like Laura, Ellie, and Pat turn to when the beatings continue? Their friends won't understand. They can't talk to them. That's where the transition house enters the picture, the secret stopping off spot for the woman who wants out. Transition workers like Kathy Starr operate the small numbers of homes for women who want a place out of reach from their husbands.
Very quickly, good relationships develop between women staying in the house. They're very supportive of one another, and she very immediately sees that she's not alone, that there are other women in the same situation. And it's a very warm, comfortable, safe place to be. All of the women, I was talking to a woman today, a past resident, who was telling me, hooray, hooray for you. If you guys hadn't been there, I don't know what I would have done. And she was one of those women that was terrified of the idea of coming to transition, but felt well, I have to come. I have no place else to go. And after she got here, said, wow, why didn't I come here before?
How many would you turn away in a year?
That's hard to say. If we saw 400 women last year, we probably turned away close to 400 because we just didn't have space.
And when you're talking about turning away those 400, that's a very small percentage of what's out there.
Very small. It's just the tip of the iceberg.
Women from all walks of life come here because wife battering has no social barriers.
Whether a woman is on welfare or whether she lives in British properties, she's getting beaten. It's broad spectrum. We've had doctors' wives. We had a woman in here last week with 2 Rolls Royces. She chose to go home because she wasn't prepared to change her lifestyle at this point. So it's alcohol is involved in large numbers of them.
Money?
Money, definitely. A woman living upper middle class has no more money than a woman on welfare. That's her own money. And that's what often keeps a woman in a situation.
Security.
Yeah, security is there, even though she is repeatedly beaten. There's a certain amount of security in the familiarity. She has small children. Where does she go? She has no money in her pocket. You can't go to a motel unless you've got money. There's sometimes, for some people, a stigma attached to going to welfare for help.
So you're a prisoner whether you live in the East End of
That's it.
Vancouver or British properties.
The other thing is that even if you go to welfare, you're a prisoner until you get out. Welfare can't help you. You have to be out of the situation before you can get any help from anybody.
Kath, you've been at this for 4 years in transition house setting. Have you noticed an increase in the number of mothers, wives being beaten?
I don't think that there's a big increase in the numbers that are actually being beaten. I think there's an increase in the numbers of people who are talking about it. One of the things that we're seeing are more older women in the last few years. At first, it was just basically sort of 20 to maybe 35 in the age group. And we found that there's been a big jump, that we're having women 55, 60, 65 coming into transition.
When you say a woman that old, I mean, obviously it's not a new thing. This has been going on for some time.
No.
I find it really hard to believe that somebody could stand, say, being beaten for 5, 6 years and not get out of it.
For some people, that's normal. Or they feel that it's normal. Their own background. As children, they've been beaten. They've watched their parents beat on each other.
So this is an aspect that in the battered wife syndrome where they've watched parents do it and they think it's a normal thing.
Definitely. For them also, alcohol, even as children, has been involved.
When we're talking about this pattern from childhood, we're talking about the son watching dad beat mom, daughter watching mom being beaten.
And your parents are prime role models for children, so that if you're beaten as a child and that's what to you is familiar, then chances are better than good that your children are going to follow the same pattern that you do.
What would be a prime reason for arguments, fights, fist fights? Lack of communication?
Lack of communication, money, houses with the children, lack of friends, both husband and wife wanting to go out.
No flexibility in a marriage.
No flexibility.
When we're talking numbers, I've heard one statistic, 1 in 2, perhaps 1 in 3 are battered wives.
I think that's a pretty fair assessment.
These pictures in this transition house were taken just before Christmas. There were just a couple of battered women here then, because Christmas is the time when the season catches up with the reality of the battered wife syndrome, and many call a truce for a time and forgive their husbands and go home. But it usually doesn't work out.
We're very quiet at Christmas. We have women who will come in and stay up till about the 21st, 22nd, and then we sort of cool out over Christmas and January. Not the 1st of January because there's holidays, Christmas and then there's New Year's, but about the 15th of January, all hell breaks loose. The bills start coming in, you know, the realization that things have been overspent at Christmas. And it's just boom, we explode in January. We also explode around license time and insurance time.
What advice would you have for the thousands of other battered wives out there that don't know that they are battered wives and how to get out of it?
I would say to definitely, if they really want help, which I think they all will come to that realization eventually, and have children, to do something about it now, to phone crisis centers or, you know, places of this sort and actually find help. If they can't get their husbands or say their fathers, whatever it is that's involved, to get help with them, that they could get help for themselves. And then maybe they can continue with their life instead of getting worse and feeling that it's never going to change.
Wife battering, to the surprise of many husbands, is common assault, a criminal offense, and many disputes end up in family court. Judge Douglas Campbell has seen too many of those common assault cases in the 5 years he spent on the bench.
It's a crime of violence, which I think is of the most serious category, and I don't think anyone in this system underestimates its significance.
Do you think society in general underestimates its significance?
There has been a lot of discussion about that, and there's been the criticism that people perceive it to be a social problem, and therefore not to be dealt with in any of the usual ways that breaches of the peace are dealt with. That might be seen to be dealing with it in a less serious way. And there has been some complaint that historically that's the way family violence cases have been dealt with.
Most husbands charged with common assault, even to the end, can't accept the full blame of their actions. It's common to put blame elsewhere, but almost all of them are embarrassed to be in court. Husbands who beat their wives who come into your court, do you see them go away as sorry for their action? Is there any remorse?
Quite often there's a lot of remorse. Quite often there's very little I can do to make that person feel worse than he does the day he walks in the door.
It's pretty humiliating, I
Quite. And it's an incident which often arises which a person is very sorry for thereafter. Often that doesn't do much good, however, because it has initiated a family breakup on occasion. It puts that person in criminal jeopardy, which is this court's responsibility to enforce. And often the simple fact of remorse isn't a factor of great weight, but it's very often present. And some of those wife-battering cases in family court shouldn't be judged in that court at all. Judge Campbell has seen cases where husbands came very close to murder. Sometimes what I wonder about is the manner in which the case has been dealt with from the outset. With some of those cases, they would qualify, I think, for a much more serious look than perhaps the charge that has indeed been laid. I'm not sure in those individual instances what kind of factors come into play at the time that the lady chooses to lay the charge, but when you see the aftermath, you wonder whether indeed it is strictly a common assault matter or an assault causing bodily harm.
Could be a much more serious...
Could very well be.
And the police will tell you about those many incidents of family violence that they're called to. For many of the homicides they investigate each year started with an argument and then a fist fight between a husband and his wife.
Serious assaults and some homicides are the results of what started out to be a family fight, and for example, it could end up going through the kitchen, and as we all know, kitchens are full of weapons such as rolling pins and knives, and the first thing you know, you have a real serious matter on your hands.
For worse, in sickness and in health, they lived happily ever after, until the beatings began. So many beatings you can't even count the times. There are a lot more like her, living in fear, afraid to leave, afraid to stay.
Really, I don't know about any of this. I'm fine. Nothing happened, okay?
I don't suppose anybody has all the answers to this wife-beating syndrome, and I don't know whether it's any worse now than it ever was. I've been dealing with it on and off in limited ways with telephone calls for 20 years. So let's talk to Flora MacLeod, who's the coordinator of the Task Force on Family Violence. She works for United Way. Now, is it any worse than it ever was? Do we know more? Can we do any more effectively to help people in these circumstances?
Chances are, Jack, it's probably not worse than it ever was. Our history, our anthropologists are uncovering evidence from this from way back, and even more currently. Some of the phrases we use now, like rule of thumb, comes from that very situation. The rule was, and this was in colonial America, that a man shouldn't really beat his wife with a stick any larger than his thumb. And
that was the rule of thumb?
That was the rule of thumb. And so there's, you know, built into our myths and into our fairy tales, there are references to this. We don't think it was uncommon, no. It's just now, however, that it's become of more concern. During the 60s, it was the discovery of child abuse, and during the 70s, emphasis on the problems of family violence in the home.
But I take it, I mean, quite sincerely, that youngsters today going into marriage or any kind of relationship are better rounded, better educated, they certainly know more about the world than my generation knew, and surely know enough to escape from this kind of behavior.
Well, one would hope so, but we're discovering that it's still very common, and the three women who were interviewed certainly give evidence of that. They are expected as women to be responsible for the marriage and the family. He is head of the household, and our laws, even yet, establish that he is the one who has power over the rest of the members of that.
Does it happen in a two-paycheck family?
Oh, yes.
Just
yes.
as much as in a one-paycheck family?
I'm not sure about just as much because our statistics aren't awfully complete, but transition house workers have described women who have come into transition house who are working. Generally, however, their paycheck is under his control completely, and that sort of total control is one of the features of this sort of situation.
Now I want to talk to Car 86, if you don't mind being referred to as a car. This is Constable Ann Beeftink of the Vancouver City Police. What exactly is the function of Car 86?
To attend family dispute calls all over the city of Vancouver, whether it's Vancouver South or North.
What's the kind of situation you do attend, and what's the kind of problem you have to deal with?
We attend all sorts of family dispute calls, whether it's child abuse or parent abuse or wife beating or husband beating, which hasn't happened very often.
We'll get there, though. We'll take me to a doorstep where you get a frantic telephone call and you go up there and here's the husband and the wife and her face is a mass of blood.
Usually somebody's been drinking. Usually somebody's quite drunk. The kids may or may not be in the house. They're generally not in the living room area. They're generally off in the bedrooms hiding. It may have been a child that called this in. It depends on who the complainant is, who we will talk to. The police generally is a two-man unit. Will enter the home and speak to the husband and the wife separately in separate rooms.
Can you get in easily enough most times?
Usually, yes. Usually people are quite cooperative because they both want the side of the police officer. I don't know how to put that.
That's right.
They would both like to be
They want to get on your
right.
side, yes. They
That's
want to
right.
prove to you that it wasn't their fault.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, there she is, though, but her face is all smashed up and she doesn't need to go to hospital. What happens? At that moment, she wants to see him to go to jail for life, doesn't she?
Sometimes. Sometimes she didn't call. Sometimes she's trying to protect her husband to the very end of it. If we'll say, Madam, do you want to press charges? It looks like you've been beat up and you definitely have a good common assault charge here. She'll say, no, it's the first time it's ever happened, which it probably isn't. And I don't suppose it'll ever happen again. Just leave him alone. He's my husband. I can't do anything about it now. Or she'll say, yes, I do want to press charges. And in that case, she's liable to decide the next morning that she doesn't want the charges to go on. This has happened.
She's got to go down and sign an information.
Yes, yes, with the Justice of the Peace.
Because it was, I mean, you didn't
she
witness
doesn't
the assault.
always withdraw the charge, but in a great number of the cases this happens. And I think
because of the prospect of a reconciliation.
quite often the husband will come back to the family home if she's still in the family home and say it'll never happen again, and the woman believes him.
Tell me, how many times, I mean, out of your own memory, can you think of going back to places not once but 2 or 3 times?
Car 86, half of our calls, and I'm not speaking in statistics, I'm guessing that half of our calls are repeats.
Let's go now to Jim McKenzie. Jim, are there any new techniques for dealing with this kind of thing? For instance, if I'm a wife in trouble, can I be sure of total support if I can demonstrate I've been beaten, even though my husband's got lots of money, he won't give me a nickel? Can I get total support from you people if I just gather my kids and go?
In Vancouver, there is resources for the battered wife to turn to. Unfortunately, those resources are severely limited. For instance, the Vancouver Transition House only has a certain capacity for X number of women and their children. There are a few other facilities in Vancouver to carry overload, but on the whole, I think last year, Transition House turned away well over 800 women and children because there was no physical place to put them.
Now, do you think these people who seek a transition house are really genuinely in trouble?
Indeed.
It's not just a question of a spat with the old man, let's get the hell out.
No, there might be one or two instances of that periodically, but the majority of the women, you know, have been severely abused, either physically or emotionally, or a combination of those factors.
Going to continue with my guests and with your phone calls. Think we should take phone calls? Yes, of course we should. To the point, though, after the break. It's always the kind of working class, lower middle class, and booze involved, isn't it, Jim McKenzie?
False.
False. What's the truth?
Truth is that certainly you get people from the lower socioeconomic groups battering, and certainly in a lot of cases you will find alcohol present. But you'll also get the upper middle class, the architect, your lawyer, your doctor, who are non-alcoholics, who aren't drinking at the time when it occurs.
Well, in that case, it's got to be pretty bad before the proud wife in Point Grey O'Shaughnessy is going to call the cops.
Indeed. As a matter of fact, most often they don't. The people with the money and the resources will often turn to private therapists if they're going to seek any kind of help at all, but in many cases they don't. It's a matter of faith, of pride.
Oh, now, isn't the only answer, Flora? If somebody's battering somebody and does it more than once or twice, and children are involved, regardless of the economic circumstances, get the hell out.
It's probably when the children involve themselves directly that the woman who is in the sort of circumstance Jim describes takes her first real step. Up until that time, she's really not encouraged to point out that this rising young executive or hardworking man is someone who does what he does at home. He's a nice fellow, he gets along well at work, he's got a job. Why should she upset what should be the normal situation?
But if he
for
beats
her?
the children, will the wife, generally speaking, go? Or will she put up with that too?
Well, it varies. Probably it's wise to leave the first time, because we've learned that violence of that sort escalates, it gets worse.
It gets easier after you hit for the first time, it seems like. Once you've struck out once, it's easier the next time, and so on.
Violence becomes a matter of course.
It does, and as I say, it's when the children get to be teenagers, perhaps, and intercede in some way that she finally makes the move and decides that this can't go on. By then, the damage may be done. They've grown up in a home where they've witnessed violence, and whether or not they have been the target of that violence, they've been subject to abuse.
You've come across that in the West End with young prostitutes.
Yeah, I've noticed when asking the kids about their backgrounds, male and female juvenile prostitutes, they'll often say that they were beaten as kids. Now, it's difficult to say whether or not this is true, but it seems to be a consistent thing that most of these kids will say that they were beat either by father or by mother or by a relative.
How often does Cat 86 or its equivalent, though, get called up to some really posh place? Not very often.
Very rarely. As I was saying, most of our calls have something to do with alcohol in some form, and they're not the posh places generally. The police aren't called to the
Didn't you try an experiment at one time where social workers went out with the police?
That's car 86.
Oh, there's a social
worker and a police officer in a police car answering police calls and crisis center calls if we're asked to attend.
Does the presence of the social worker, I suppose that helps the policeman.
Oh yeah, the counseling is generally done by the social worker in the car. The keeping of the peace in the home is done by the police officer in the home.
A most unenviable task, isn't it? 3 o'clock in the morning, everybody half drunk, tears all over the place, broken furniture and blood.
Yes.
And kids crying.
And kids crying and screaming.
Crying, yeah, and blood.
And blood. Let's take some phone calls. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to speak to the social worker on there.
All right, now, Jim, would you answer to that camera? Okay. And if you get calls, Anne, will you answer to that camera? Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead, ma'am.
Yes, 2 years ago, I was beaten severely on a Saturday night, and I had took my baby and I fled from my home and went to a friend's place in which I was stayed. I spent the weekend there. Monday morning, I went to Human Resources and explained to them what had happened. I had black eyes and my nose was all puffed out, and explained to them what had happened. And they said that they couldn't do anything, that they would have to get in touch with my husband. I gave them the telephone number of the house in which, the home phone number, the address, and the place in which he was working. They said they would get back to me. 2 days later, I got a phone call from them saying that your husband loves you, you've got a home, he's willing to provide for you, and we can't do anything for you because we can only help you.
Did you go back?
I went back, I stayed for another month, and then I left
Why?
because I couldn't take it anymore.
You still...
My kid and I were getting beaten up, and I couldn't stand it, but I didn't get on human resources. I had to go and live with another man and get an education and then get out on my own.
Why didn't you call the police?
Why didn't you call the police?
When you are beaten up, first of all, when you get beaten up, you're just frantic. You don't know what to do. Your mind is just not, you're not all together. The only thing you can think about is the police takes time. All right, it takes too much time for the police to get there. And it's happened several times before.
Well, I don't think it takes too much time if there's a desperate call for the police, does it?
No, if you're calling the police or a social worker, if you're being beaten up, I believe that the police are going to get there first.
Hold on, please, ma'am. What am I going to do about my cough? Can't get rid of my cough this morning. Will I take a break? I'll take a break, get rid of my cough, and come back again. Please forgive me, everybody.
Go ahead, please.
Mr. Webster?
Go ahead.
Mr. Webster?
Won't work. I was going to say to Ann to do the talking for me in case I started to cough again.
I'm not Jack Webster.
Go ahead, please.
Hi, Mr. Webster. I'd like to compliment you on a very excellent program. I'm in municipal politics, and I'm chairman of the social services. And where I find the difficulty is getting the financing for a transition house.
We're not
I went last year to Mrs. McCarthy with a very well-organized brief, and she heard me out, as well as on various other social service problems in our area. And I've had various correspondence with her, and she feels that you can fund a 10-bed transition house on $49,000.
Can you?
No, you can't. If you're going to have 10 beds, and you're going to have to staff the unit, you're also going to have to feed the people, you're going to have to pay rent and heat. $49,000 doesn't go very far.
Which city are we talking about, ma'am?
I'm talking about Richmond.
About Richmond. You don't have a transition house?
We don't. We have an excellent crisis line.
You have lots of wife beating or husband beating?
Yes. Well, no, the crisis line that deals with all crisis problems in Richmond. They have 2 beds, which are constantly filled with various...
well, perhaps Flora MacLeod of the United Way has some thoughts on the need for more transition houses. Do you play an active part in campaigning for financing of transition houses?
I am on the board of United Way out here.
Oh, good.
Yes, particularly...
I have got all the reports...
Okay, let's see what Flora says about it.
In the divisions, which in United Way terms means the North Shore, Richmond, Burnaby, North and South Fraser, the social planners have worked actively towards Transition House. The newest one is on the North Shore. It's called the Emily Murphy Transition House and opened only at Christmas. And I understand it's been heavily used since it was open. Burnaby and Richmond still have not succeeded after years of work in attracting the funds from the provincial government to establish their own municipal resource.
Well, they've got lots of money for lottery giveaways. I don't know why they can't raise some money for transition houses.
Well, this is where we're going to go, Mr. Webster. We're going to try the lottery fund money.
Ma'am, thanks for the compliments to Brian and his preparation of the program, too.
Excellent.
Much obliged. Go ahead, please. Yes, yes.
Hello, Mr. Webster.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I would like to congratulate you for your show, and I know that you have a very good show. I just listening to...
Have you a question for any of my guests?
I'm sorry?
Have you a question?
Well, you see, this wife beating, you know, I'm not from Canada, and I could not believe the number of wife being beaten, you know, by the husband. You see, like...
oh, we're not the worst in the world by a long shot, are we?
No,
Jim?
No, indeed. It's a phenomena that happens in every culture, in every society, all the way around the world. And whether we're more prevalent, I don't think so.
Oh, no, I don't think we're the worst by a long shot.
No.
I suggest if you go to Glasgow or Belfast or Dublin, you will find triple the amount of wife beating you find in a comparatively civilized country such as Canada.
Yeah.
It was in England, Jack, that the Transition House movement began. Aaron Pitsey with Chiswick House was the very first, and it was her idea that
when I was a young reporter in Glasgow, it was a national sport, wife beating. There isn't any doubt about that at all. No, I don't accept what you say about it being worse here than anywhere else. Go ahead, please.
Hello, I wanted to know if it was the Socrat government that actually cut back on the number of transition houses in the past few years.
Have any been closed?
Yes.
No, none have been closed, to my knowledge. As a matter of fact, I believe that some of the present Socrat members have been instrumental in helping develop some of the transition houses in BC.
There's no doubt there's a political pressure is needed in this field as in every other field for additional things in the way of health, welfare and transition houses. But I don't want to turn this into a political program as such. Port Alberni, go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. I believe the wife-beating problem is much, much deeper as it looks like. I want to see the other side of the coin, too.
What's the other side?
The man's side.
You mean why he beats her?
Yes. I also see that many women taking on their wives before they are married, their husbands, you know, and let the husbands believe that you can have sex anytime you want, for number one. That I am happy with a little bit. I don't things in this life.
Okay, let me put that in perspective. Have you ever come across a case on Car 86, or you in your investigations?
I have.
Wait, just a second, my dear, till I finish the question to the panel. Where the man was justified in, where a spouse was justified in beating another spouse.
Never justified.
Yeah, hold
Just a
on.
moment, madam. I don't think that there's justification for violence in a family setting.
Ever.
I don't think there's much justification for violence anywhere. But I don't think it has much to do with sex either, to the caller. I think it has a whole lot to do with alcohol and a whole lot to do with not being able to control yourself.
Bad temper.
Bad temper.
For various reasons or another.
Well, okay, I'd like to differ a little bit with that, Ann. A lot of the women that I've talked to have said that sexuality certainly has been involved in this. The husband wants to have intercourse and she doesn't want to, and in effect you almost have marital rape going on in some situations.
I wasn't talking about family violence in terms of rape. I was talking about family violence in terms of somebody not getting what they want. I guess, could it be sex or whatever, and taking it out on the other person, usually the weaker person in the relationship.
Right. Yeah, and we're all agreed there's no justification, even if it is a sexual matter, to beat the hell out of the partner.
No. The alcohol issue is an important one too, Jack. It has for years been used as an excuse. In court you could say, well, I didn't remember what happened, it was the liquor what did it. And increasingly that's less acceptable in court and everywhere else. People are responsible for their actions. And we've learned in talking to the women and to the men too who are and have been batterers that they were in control, that they did know what they were doing, and generally they went out to drink in order to beat.
Yeah. One interesting point is I've talked to a lot of the men who do batter, and many of them have reported that they have attempted to talk to other people about what's going on in order to get some help. And these people have included family, friends, clergy, professional helpers, police, and the response that they've met from these other people has been of denial that it could ever happen to a nice family like you, or no, you know, you would never do anything like that, or else a lot of value judgments. You're a horrible, nasty person. I don't want to have anything to do with you. So they get turned off or denied that it's even happened. And it's very difficult for them to find somebody even to talk about what's going on.
Salmon Arm, go ahead, please.
Yes, I was in Walford last year, and the welfare seemed to think that my husband was living with me while I was on welfare, which was untrue. And they wanted me to come into the office.
What's this got to do with it?
Tell her to call the MHR, to call her social worker.
You're not on about wife beating, are you? Is she?
Yes, in a way, probably.
I just can't get... Tell me the story, ma'am. What happened?
Okay, he was beating me all the time, and I had left him.
I see.
I had gone for social assistance, and I went on, and I had moved to get away from my husband, and he moved to the same town as me. And he would come over, and he was visiting the kids, and slowly getting back together. And he would stay maybe one night a week. And the
welfare then challenged you about your check and whatnot.
Right. Yes. And they cut me off completely, and they said that he had been living with me, and I... Well,
ma'am, that's an administrative problem that often arises, and perhaps we can get some broad advice from my two people here.
This is something the Task Force on Family Violence looked at and made some recommendations about. The basis of the policy that we recommended was that when a woman comes to a social worker and explains what her situation is, that she be believed. And that she not be required as a very first step to go and lay a charge. The first thing she needs is a refuge and safety and a place for that weekend for herself and her children. Then there's time to discuss the other matters of legal aspects, the application for welfare, his obligation to provide some support to her.
Yeah.
But what women, like this woman is describing, she faces a denial from the social worker that in fact the situation she has at home is happening to her.
The very important thing on which we can finish this note is that when a woman complains to whichever authority, that your task force on family violence recommends that in the first instance, without quibble or squabble, the woman be believed.
Yes, exactly.
Even without physical evidence of being beaten to a pulp, and that she be given the necessary shelter until the matter can be looked into.
That physical evidence is important. Often women are beaten where it doesn't show. There are internal injuries that can happen, and there's a whole range of other sorts of abuse. If there are children in the home particularly, social workers should accept that and do something on an emergency basis.
And I think that's common sense. I think the attitude has changed towards that a long way in the past few years. But we do need more transition houses.
Indeed.
I would agreed. And we don't need any more car 86s when that great day comes when people stop beating their wives or vice versa.
Let's hope.
My thanks to Constable Ann Beeftink, to Jim McKenzie, and to Flora MacLeod for the Task Commission on Family Violence. We've tried this morning merely to make you a little more conscious of it, and if you are in trouble, do not hesitate to seek instant help. And I'll be back after the break.